Mom taught us one rule: always check for your shadow. Every few hours, the three of us, Mom, Curly, and me, would do a shadow check. It was as second nature as taking a sip of water. Shadow check. My mom would call, and we'd both look down, checking that our shadow was still there. I thought everyone did this. We were homeschooled, so no one really told me otherwise. And my one friend down the block, Samantha, was a little strange herself, so she never seemed to notice. But then Mom got a job, and Curly and I went to school. And that's when everything collapsed. "What are you doing?" Paige asked me, as we stood outside for recess one cool fall afternoon. "Shadow check," I replied. "Duh." "Shadow check?" she asked, confused. "What's that?" I squinted at her. "You don't know what a shadow check is?" It was like she'd told me she didn't know how to brush her teeth. I explained, slowly in simple terms, like I was talking to a baby. "You look at the ground. To check your shadow is still there." She obediently looked at the ground. "There it is." Then she raised her arms out in front of her and linked them, making her shadow look like the letter P. "Look. It's like P, for Paige." In no time at all, half of the class was doing it. We'd bound out for recess, and someone would shout, "Shadow check." The kids would contort their bodies into weird shapes to make their shadows look like elephants or cats or letters, and we'd try to guess what they were. That went on nicely for about 3 days. Then, horror struck. On Thursday afternoon, it was overcast. "Shadow check," Thomas shouted. I diligently looked down and saw my shadow. But when I looked up, I realized nobody else had a shadow. For a second I wanted to panic, and scream, and run. But then I took a deep breath, and did exactly what my mom taught me. I grabbed Paige first. "Hey," she protested. But I didn't listen. I held on with a vice grip and started pulling her back towards the school. When the shadow goes away, hide in darkness for a day. The mantra echoed in my head. The school had a basement. I'd heard the teachers mention it. The basement would be safe. All we had to do was stay there until the morning. "Let go of me," Paige screeched, finally yanking her wrist out of my grasp. "What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you?" I screamed back. "We have to hide." The kids weren't smiling anymore. They were staring at me, backing away, like I was a rabid animal. "We have to hide." I screamed again. "All the shadows are gone." I grabbed at Paige again, but she dodged this time. I lost my footing and fell onto the asphalt. Pain stung my knees. I looked up at my classmates. Why aren't they hiding? "What are you doing?" "Run," I screamed. That's when a teacher helped me up and took me right to the principal's office. I should have explained more clearly, my mother told that night, as she tucked me in. "The shadow thing is only for us. It's okay if other people don't have shadows." "Why?" Sadness flashed across her face for a second. Then she shook her head. "That's just the way it is." No one talked to me at recess anymore. Not even Paige. I sat alone all the time. I noticed, now, that there were many days, and some classrooms, even, when people didn't have shadows. I always did. But they didn't. Months passed and eventually kids forgot about the incident. That's what kids do, forget. Sometimes I wish forgiving and forgetting came easier to adults. Paige would run up to me at recess and we'd play hopscotch. She never brought up the fact that even on an overcast day, my shadows still danced across the chalk lines, mirroring my own movements. Except sometimes, they were the slightest bit out of sync. Like my shadow was moving on a split-second delay. As I got older, however, things got more complicated. In 7th grade science, the teacher taught us about the sun, and optics, and light. Prisms and rainbows and the cones and rods in our eyes. And she mentioned that our shadow was just the absence of light, that our bodies were blocking out the sun or the overhead fluorescent lights. It didn't make sense to me, then, that my shadow, or anyone else's, would be able to disappear. If the lighting didn't change, and I didn't move, how could a shadow suddenly disappear? Curly was now old enough to insist we called her by her real name, but she was still too young to understand the argument I had with my mom that night. "It's not possible," I shouted, as she worked on her coloring book upstairs. "You're lying to me." "I'm not lying to you," my mother pleaded. "Yes, you are." I ran across the living room to get in my mom's face. Walked right past the ornate glass lamp that stood on the end table. My mom's eyes widened. She looked at the ground. And that's when I realized my shadow was gone. The lamp was behind me. My shadow should have been on the floor in front of me. But it wasn't. "Run," she whispered. When I didn't move, she began to shout. "Go to Curly. Go." I hesitated for half a second. Then I sprinted for the stairs. "Turn off the light," she shouted after me. I darted in and closed to the door. Then I bent down and yanked out the plug to the lamp. "Hey," Curly said. "I'm coloring." "SSSSH," I whispered. "What?" My shadow disappeared. Curly was too young to remember the day her shadow disappeared. She'd only been a year old. Mom had scooped her out of the playpen, grabbed me by the hand, and took the three of us into the basement. We spent the night down there, in total darkness, eating canned beans and sleeping on old comforters, laid out on the cement floor. But she knew that it was bad. She scrambled over to her bed and pulled the covers over her head. I stood in the center of the room, listening for Mom's footsteps. They never came. Is she staying down there? But we had so many lights on down there. It would be safer to just run to us. I crept towards the door, my heart pounding, slipping over the Barbies Curly had all over the floor. "Mom?" I called out, through the door. Nothing. I opened the door just a crack and peered out. I could see the stairs, the light spilling out from the living room. But everything was silent. Maybe she went into the basement. Maybe a shadow appeared, cast across the wall. No. She's still down there? But no. That couldn't be my mom's shadow. It was too short. And even though the edges were blurry, the shadow sort of looked like it had a ponytail. Not a short hair in a pixie cut, like my mom. That's not Mom. That's me. The blurry edges sharpened. And then the figure, the shadow, came into view. My ponytail, my upturned nose, my knock knees. The thing crouched down and pulled at something, yanking it, moving completely independent of me. A dragging sound, my mother's feet came into view. Still and lifeless. I gasped. My hand clapped to my mouth, but it was too late. The shadow froze, turned to stare directly at me. And then with huge, loping strides, it started up the stairs. I slammed the door shut, clicked the lock. Then I jumped under the covers with Curly, my entire body trembling. The police never found Mom's body. She was eventually declared legally dead. Curly and I were sent away to live with our grandparents. They didn't seem to know anything about the shadow. They never asked us to do shadow checks. The only remark in 10 years was my grandma, on a particularly cloudy day, remarking how strange it was that I cast a perfect shadow on the sidewalk in front of us. I watched it as I walked, and noticed its movements weren't perfectly in sync with my own. As the years went by, and my shadow didn't disappear again, I started to get complacent. I checked for it less and less frequently. I started to lead a normal life, getting hired as a real estate agent. Curly, now going by her name Rebecca, is 19 and in college. I even started to persuade myself that my shadow didn't kill her. That my mom ran away after our fight, and my memory of the shadow was my way of coping with it. Because it was harder to accept my mom had abandoned us than it was to accept an evil shadow had killed her. That's what I told myself, until tonight. As I sat down on my computer to finish writing a house listing, I noticed there was no shadow of my fingers on the keyboard. No shadow on the linoleum under the desk. I ran to turn off all the lights. But I don't think I was fast enough. Because when I ran to close the blinds, to block out the light from the street lamp below, I saw my shadow, walking across the dark street, disappearing into the night. So please, I beg you, if you see any strange shadows in your home, or outside, something you don't think is cast by the lights, by the objects in your home, something that looks different, hide. Somewhere pitch dark, where no shadows can be cast until morning.